Welcome to our study, Women Speak of God. We often think of the past as truly past, as something finished, as something done, and often as something irrelevant. Especially in our own day and time, we think of our own time as somehow new and improved, that things from the past are inferior, that our own time is surely smarter, wiser, more technologically advanced, that we must somehow be superior simply by living later in history. This is called the progressive view of history, so things progress and get better and better. So it's sort of hard to think about why should we bother listening to ancient voices and listening to people from the past. Our way of thinking about the past is very different from the ancient way of thinking. In the ancient world, older is better. Things new are suspect. Innovations are not to be trusted. But we are convinced that new and improved tide is really new and improved, that newer is an improvement and is better. In the Christian family, sometimes the converse is true. Sometimes we think that the time of Jesus was the golden time of faith. It was the best time to be alive, and that it's downhill from there. That the Christian family was at its height, and it's just a series of errors since then. So that's another way to think about God being present and then sort of going dormant. And often we think about our own history as a Christian family that way. All of these assumptions we bring to the table when we listen to these women's voices and what they have to say about God. Some of our assumptions are that history is irrelevant. Some of our assumptions are that our own Christian family surely can't be as stellar as the first Christians could be. But if we think of studying church history and hearing these voices as a family reunion, then we can reframe how to receive and how to listen. So think about what happens at a family reunion. Aunts and uncles, grandmothers and grandfathers, cousins, people come to the family reunion and gather to tell stories. Just as in our family of faith, when we gather, we hear in our family of faith the scripture stories, and we hear in our family of faith the history stories. When you think of the last family reunion you went to, you probably heard some of the same stories that you hear every time you gather. The same stories. Why those stories? Because those are the stories that tell who we are as a family. The same stories that are told over and over that form us in becoming a member of that family. We also hear the same fights often over and over. And Uncle Larry still won't sit down to eat at the same table with Uncle David. You know, and it's been 15 years. And sometimes at family reunions, we hear secrets or a surprise unearthed. We might say, I was 40 years old before I found out my Aunt Edna had been married once before. Why didn't anybody tell me that? That there are things in the family that are stories not told very often or are too painful to tell. The son who died in the war, the niece who drowned. And those stories aren't told as frequently. They're just too hard to tell, and yet they're the stories that make up the family's culture and the family's identity. Growing up, I heard a story over and over again. My great-grandfather, Ira Clark, was a railroad man in Amarillo, Texas. He owned a piece of property in downtown Amarillo and sold it, a very valuable piece of property, because he had a dream that he wanted to spend the summer taking his 6 kids to Chicago to get music lessons. So he sold the property. He took his 6 kids, one of whom was my grandmother, Lily Oden. And they spent the summer riding the streetcar and making boiled egg sandwiches. And the 3 older kids took violin, harp, and piano lessons in the morning. And the afternoon, their job was to teach what they'd learned to the 3 younger kids. They couldn't afford for them all to take lessons. And my grandmother told this story with great pride and great joy. Now, this story could be the story of a man who was irresponsible, who wasted his resources. But in my family, this was a story about who we are. We're a family that is musical. We're a family that drinks deep from the well of life and that knows how to use resources for things that matter. That's what it is to be an Odin. I learned how to be an Odin by being at Odin family gatherings, by hearing this story of the Chicago Summer of Music lessons. You know this in your own family of origin, and in the family that you may marry into. By being in the family, you learn what they value, what they expect, what they identify as characteristics of what it means to be a Smith or a Sanchez or a Patel. You've heard and been formed by the family stories and the gatherings and the reunions you're in.